All those years wasted fighting each other, Charles. To have a precious few of them back.
We knew we were going to do a sequel to X-Men First Class. We didn't know what story we were going to tell.
I knew that I wanted the primary story to take place 10 years later, in 1973. And there was a desire on the part of Matthew Vaughn and I to try to find a way to incorporate the favorite characters and the older characters. It was really tough, and we couldn't quite crack it.
We spent a long time hunting down what the story would be. And somewhere in the process, there was an executive at 20th Century Fox who suggested using Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen as bookends to the movie. And the second he said that, I felt like we should do Days of Future Past.
Amongst us, Bryan and Simon, and those of us who have been involved with the franchise for a long time, we had always wanted to do Days of Future Past.
It's a very complex, ambitious story, but at its heart, it's a powerfully thematic and emotional story. It's been a project that everybody's been discussing doing for maybe going back a decade.
There was a great precedent for time travel in the X-Men universe. So Simon went off with Matthew. At this point, Matthew was going to direct the film. I was just going to produce it, and crafted a rough draft for X-Men Days of Future Past.
Matthew, for various reasons, was unable to do it, and so fortunately Bryan was available.
As a science fiction geek, time travel movies are a subgenre that I've always loved. But the pitfalls of writing a time travel movie are nightmarish. You're constantly stuck with the sort of paradox of time travel, that anything that happens in the past is going to ripple into the future. And one of the first things he wanted to do was create a rule that would essentially eliminate those paradoxes.
I kind of came up with a theory based loosely on quantum physics, which is outcomes are different after they observe than they are before they observe. So my concept was that Wolverine became the observer, so past and future can exist simultaneously. The moment he woke up in the future, everything he had done would then take hold.
This film is really two movies in one, the future and the past. And what the future means is I get to work with all the X-Men that I first worked with 14 years ago.
When I heard that we were teaming up with all the previous cast, that actually sent chills up my spine. And what I think Bryan has done so brilliantly is he has melded the two universes so well. Well, they're not different universes, they're the same universe, but he's merged the two sort of disparate spheres of X-Men that exist on film, and he's kind of brought them together brilliantly.
I've always enjoyed the continuity of characters, and so to me it feels like an ongoing story. But, you know, it's going to take James McAvoy a year or two before he actually looks like me.
With First Class, it was very much sort of Eric, and by the end we see him sort of dressed up as Magneto, and we see how that alter ego becomes realized. This is James's journey, how Charles gets to that point.
This film has really captured one of the essences of the comics, which I think appeals to people, that you can dip in and out of these stories and see old Magneto and young Magneto.
Ultimately, when you're dealing with time travel, it enables you to take characters in completely new directions, reset history, bring some characters back, but at the same time, enable the future to have a mystery of possibilities.
The future. A dark, desolate world.
The original story, Days of Future Past, by Chris Claremont and John Byrne, tells the story of time travel. In that story, you've got this wonderful idea of changing the future by changing the past.
John Byrne and I were getting to the end of our run together. We'd just come off of Dark Phoenix, which was a fairly massive 2-year saga, which culminated in the surprise death of Jean Grey. And we did 2 issues to introduce Kitty to the team, and we were trying to figure out what we could do next which would take everybody by surprise. And in this case, John and I hit the jackpot.
It's arguably one of the most iconic X-Men stories of the whole new run.
It put each of the characters into unfamiliar circumstances, which is what I always want to see.
Professor, you made it.
The biggest change we made from the source material, from the original comics, is obviously who gets sent back. In the comic, it's Kitty Pryde, Ellen Page's character. But we really wanted to remain true to the idea that it's a consciousness that's being sent back in time to a younger body. And because of the way that we cast Ellen in X-Men The Last Stand, she was so young that to send her back to the 1960s or 1970s, she'd be like negative 10, 20 years old. So she wouldn't even be conceived yet, let alone an actual character that could talk.
What if someone's mind has a way of snapping back? What if someone can heal as fast as they're ripped apart?
The reason we changed it to Wolverine was he's existed hundreds of years, but also he looks the same. So we can have the same actor, Hugh Jackman, and he can slip back into his younger consciousness and kind of look and sound relatively the same.
Getting to see our Logan interact with the young cast was kind of a temptation that couldn't be resisted.
Once I started thinking about what it would mean to send Wolverine back in time, I just fell in love with this notion that a character who had been essentially taught and saved by Professor Xavier would have to go back in time to teach and save young Charles with the same lessons he'd learned.
It's sort of like sending Wolverine to the peace talks in the Middle East. He's not really the guy who's going to be brokering peace. So this is a kind of role reversal.
I was a very different man then. You'll have to be patient with me.
Patience is my strongest suit.
There is a new enemy out there. An enemy that will render your arsenals useless, your armies powerless, and your nations defenseless.
Another place that we really diverged from the original books is that the target of the assassination is Senator Kelly in the Days of Future Past comic. Now, Bryan in X-Men 1 and 2 had used Bruce Davison to play Senator Kelly, and so he was a contemporary character that we couldn't use in 1973. He wouldn't have been a senator or really in any sort of position of power. And Trask, because of his relationship to the Sentinels, has always been this really interesting character.
Boulevard Trask's character in this movie is a scientist first and foremost. He's an engineer, and he actually inherently is a lover of peace. And the movie takes place just at the end of the Vietnam War, so the United States consciousness is ravaged by war, and his concern with all the losses on both sides makes him see mutants as this amazing opportunity to unite all of humanity against this potential threat of extinction.
He has the power to control metal. Last I checked, that's what most of your weapons were made of. And she can transform into anyone. A general, a secret serviceman, even you, Mr. President. Especially in comic books, where it is the heroes and the villains, you're often not given the reason why the villain is villainous. But Trask is very realistically drawn. And there's people out there like him that exist, especially in politics. Basically, he's the Iago whispering into the political ear.
Never before, in all of human history, has there been a cause which could unite us as a species. Until now.
He's not the traditional evil bad guy. He doesn't twirl his mustache, even though I have a nice mustache to twirl. He's a businessman, he's a scientist, and he has real respect for the mutants, and he really admires them. And he believes in what he's doing, not in any sort of dark, sinister way. And that's much more interesting to me as an actor, to play someone who does unethical things, but believes in that and doesn't judge it.
Originally, we were going to have Mystique shoot him. The script actually led you to there, and then we realized, all right, well, the message of the X-Men is not that. And so we decided to make it the point that if she did kill Trask, then the X-Men would be wiped out. Charles's philosophy has to win the day.
If I can stop the assassination, keep her out of their hands, then we can stop the Sentinels from ever being born.
And end this war before it ever begins.
When you look at the quality of the people involved, it's breathtaking.
You write for the medium you're in, and you have to be aware of that. What makes a wonderful comic book may not necessarily make a wonderful film. And Bryan did an amazing job of doing exactly that, keeping the heart and the soul of the characters, but producing a movie.
Another fun part of this process was to be able to reunite some of my core team from X-Men 1 and 2. From X-Men 1, I brought in production designer John Meyer. I had Louise Mingenbach, my costume designer from X1 and 2. I usually work with John Ottman as an editor and composer, and with Tom Siegel as a cinematographer.
It's the same crew and producers from 14 years ago. And for us all to be together with Bryan and Lauren Schilderdonna, then to add Hutch Parker and Simon Kinberg, it really is an unusually close family sort of atmosphere.
Change your posture a little bit.
Okay.
Like just hunch your shoulders.
It's really exciting because nobody really knows any more about any character in X-Men than Bryan does.
The whole reason that I wanted to come back was it was the original team, and Bryan obviously was a huge part of the reason why I'd signed on in the first place.
The style of X-Men was, with others, very much Bryan Singer's style. The quality of it, the interaction of the characters, the way the story evolves. Bryan is always very involved with the development of the narrative in the films.
Bryan did something remarkable with the first X-Men, and I think he changed the landscape of comic book films in the tone he brought to the first film, in the boldness of opening in a concentration camp. They weren't just sort of worlds unto themselves. They were actually part of our world, and I think we see it now. I think the legacy of that is now their comic book movies are really almost the dominant form of event entertainment now.
The most exciting thing about getting back to the X-Men franchise for me as a director is being able to work with the actors more intimately. On X-Men First Class, I was a writer and a producer, so I knew the actors, I was involved in casting them, but it's very different when you're there every day, intimately creating characters with the actors and defining their trajectories, and I love these actors.
That was the hardest thing in the movie, was scheduling everybody, because there was such a large cast, and they're, definitely a working cast.
Just the sheer scale of this, certainly from a cast point of view, unlike anything I'd ever seen. I think we had 12 actors with restricted dates, which is the most I've ever heard by far. It's amazing that we figured it out.
We anchored it all with Patrick and Ian. And Patrick and Ian were doing a play in New York, so we had a 5-week window with them. That was it. That started off the shoot, and we only had Hallie for so many days because she was filming. We only had Peter so many days because he was shooting. Hugh was doing publicity for the Wolverine. He was gone the whole month of July. And just juggling these schedules and getting everybody to work was crazy.
It's been marvelous. Of course, in the case of some of them, Anna, Ellen Page, they've kind of grown up a little bit. Anna was a teenager when we began, and Ellen was a very young teenager. Now they're both distinguished actresses.
It's awesome coming into this film like a family being reunited, and you don't feel ego. It's like you're all just hanging out and creating something together, and it's wonderful.
We've stayed in each other's lives over the years, and it's really nice to have the whole X-Men family back together.
It just feels very similar to X-Men 2, but then jump forward 10 years, so it's this kind of weird, surreal place.
Let's go save the world. It's really lovely to come back with a sense of what it all means, with a sense of gratitude that we're all in together. Bryan and I have stayed great friends throughout, so to be back working with him again, particularly as he's the one who gave me the role, and let's face it, Wolverine has been the basis of my career, so it's something I will never forget.
It was very fun when the original cast showed up on those first days. A lot of reunion talk and smiles and laughs, and Hugh just leaned over and was like, it's really good to be here. And it was really like an emotional beat because we hadn't been on an X-Men movie together, Hugh and I, for a very long time. So that was really a special moment for me.